Thank you. So we're a little late getting started. Sorry about that. So I'm Jason. I'm a teaching consultant with the Center for Innovation Teaching and Learning. I'm also a per-course instructor in the Faculty of Education, where I teach primarily in the special ed program. So I'll be moderating today, and I'll be letting my wonderful colleagues tell you all about their experiences in discovering and working with and designing with universal design in mind, and also, of course, the all-important student perspective. So how are these courses perceived by students? So just a couple of things. So this is recorded as well, just so you know. I think, Kathryn, you're going to be since it kind of captures the middle, you're going to be the one that's primarily in the video, but they'll get the audio too.
Is this a good sign?
Yes. So again, for those of you, for tweeters out there, if you want to kind of search up initiatives that are going on across Canada around universal design for learning, this brings you to that national conversation, which Memorial's been a part of for the last number of years now and continue to be a part of. So if you want to search that hashtag, you'll find some pretty interesting stuff going on across the country with our colleagues. We have a Google Drive for this as well. We've thrown some things in there for you. So if you want to snap the QR code now, you can snap it before you leave. Feel free to do that. The final thing we're going to do is we've created a back channel, which is used to allow participants or students, whoever they may be, to kind of have a say kind of in the background. So if a student doesn't feel, or a participant doesn't feel comfortable asking a question, or there's a question that doesn't seem to be related, but you just want to ask it anyway, you can certainly navigate your way to today's meet. And I'm going to try and maintain that as well as maintain the discussion. So if everyone's captured that, who's going to be there, I'll navigate away from that. I'll go to the today's meet screen to see if we can throw this up here. Don't panic, I'm a CITL. Don't panic. Okay, we can almost panic. Yeah, maybe.
Isn't that what Danny said this morning? The technology's always going to take longer? There you go. We just have to say Darcy.
Not necessarily. So we'll get today's meet started here. All right, no panic. So what I'll do is I'll introduce my panelists in no particular order and tell you a little bit about them, and then we'll get going on the questions. What we'd really value in this session is questions from you all. So questions for those of you that are using UDL, that believe in it highly, but challenge or struggle to see how it can be implemented in your discipline maybe, or in your work. Because this is also universal design for learning has been implicated in student services. So student services have been, not necessarily here yet, but we're getting there, have been designed with UDL in mind. So it's not just an academic issue. So we welcome and really value those questions. So we do have microphones, and we'll make sure we get you a microphone if you have a question. So I'll start with Dr. Gabrielle Young, is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education here at Memorial. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses surrounding understanding and supporting students with specific learning disorders, as well as she teaches the practicum, or leads the practicum in special education. Her research interests around the use of assistive and instructional technology in inclusive classrooms, applying the principles of universal design for learning and differentiated instruction to support students with exceptionalities in the general education classroom, and pre-service teachers' efficacy to support students in inclusive classrooms and facilitate positive mental health. So welcome, Gabrielle. That was all right, right? So I just read it. Dr. Ailsa Craig welcome and thank you for being here, is an associate professor and interim head of the Department of Sociology. She's the recipient of the 2016 President's Award for Outstanding Teaching. You probably got that from the last session without knowing that she had won that award. Dr. Craig comes to UDL through being actively engaged in student-centered learning as it connects to issues around social justice. Kathryn Shortell. Welcome. Kathryn is the inaugural Educational Accessibility Specialist in Student Life. She comes to us from the Provincial Government's Disability Policy Office, where she led the government's 3-year Inclusion Strategy Action Plan, which built strongly on the collaboration and integration of knowledge and experience of persons with disabilities who embrace universal design as a way to create not special access, but equal access. And last but not least, certainly not least, Jen Dion, who is a current graduate student in gender studies here at Memorial. And Jen has been, and brings a perspective, a student perspective, and Jen has been involved with Ailsa in research around creating courses that are universally designed. And she has the ability to sit with students and ask them, how do you experience this class and what's different? So we look forward to hearing from you, Jen. So welcome to our panelists, and we'll move right into our first question. Gabrielle, the first question's to you. So for review purposes, and in case there were folks in the room who weren't here for the session we just did, can you give us a brief overview, knowing that we're 7 minutes behind schedule? Can you give us, what do they call it? It's not an elevator pitch, but an escalator pitch, right? Can you kind of give us a broad strokes view of UDL and how it is and how it can impact teaching in post-secondary?
Sure. So universal design for learning allows us to recognize that there's no typical learner, and that really are just different when we're planning for instruction. So oftentimes, when teaching a graduate course, I expect students to have a certain level of requisite knowledge, but oftentimes you don't know how many years of work you take to undergraduate course. It's thinking about how you design a course, ensuring that everybody can access the same kind of entrance point. So oftentimes, before I introduce a unit, I will have YouTube videos with kind of keynote speakers in the same area, whether it's a TED Talk, something just to kind of get to the heart of the topic, just so that students have a baseline on which they can capture and build upon their knowledge lens. I think when you think about how you engage the students, they have to really think about what they're learning, how it's going to apply. For me, I'm a classroom teacher, and I teach teachers, so I have to always model what I'm going to do, make that really explicit and why I'm doing it, and talk to them about how they're going to do naturally. So it's in regards to how you book information, how you present information in multiple ways. We know that in the classroom and some students certainly. It's very difficult for them to listen and take notes at the same time. They don't have auditory listening delays, or they're going to take different approach so that they're already on to the next sentence or two. So making sure that we've got visuals to support. I know that I'm anxious, my mom was anxious. We can have students that class maybe even collectively differently. So oftentimes you're sending students in the class that are raising their hands to express their ideas, but doesn't mean that they don't have a lot to share. Thinking about how you use exit cards, how you use journal reflections, different ways to assess what students know, and make sure that you are reviewing that information prior to starting class, so that, again, everybody's on the same page. And again, when it comes to universal design for learning, it has to do with how you as a teacher set up instruction, but how you give students opportunities to engage with that learning. So I always want students to have role-based learning environments. I may pose a question if I sense that not everybody is responding or having confidence to respond. I may do a fair share, respond with a partner, brainstorm an idea together before you respond to the group. Sometimes, students don't have comfort level in regards to raising their hand to ask for help. So sometimes they may have a ticket kind of process or a certain kind of card process, where you may have the green cards out, walk around, going on time, if I have the red card out, stop by my desk, don't feel comfortable raising my hand to ask for help, but I may use this communication. So making sure that students have a chance to discuss orally before they're assessed, perhaps working group projects before they're expected to assess or be assessed individually. It's thinking about how you give multiple ways to engage students so that demonstrates what they know and present information.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ailsa, next to you. How and when did you learn that UDL was a thing, whatever that is? And when, and perhaps more importantly, why did you choose to kind of embrace UDL, the guidelines, the principles to inform course design, teaching practice? She's got her own.
Is that working?
Yep.
Doing anything? Okay. Can you hear me okay, though? Yep. All right. So a few years back, there was a conference that Munsu put together, and they brought in Eli Clare as a keynote speaker for that. And Eli is a disabled queer and trans writer and speaker, and this is about 4 years ago, if I'm remembering correctly. And one of the things that he did, other than just doing the keynote address, is he did a disability awareness workshop for educators. And I think there were a grand total of 4 of us in the room. How there were only 4 of us for Eli Clare, I don't know, because he's brilliant. And it was there that I first heard the term at all, universal design for learning. I knew about it for architecture, but I hadn't learned about it, and I was really curious. And then, as luck would have it, that was the same year that Jason and Gabrielle had it was through CITL, I guess it was then DELTS, in 2014.
Yep.
There was a universal design, and I had missed it, right? So it was over by the time I heard about the term, and I saw right after, it was, I think right after I did the workshop with Eli, I saw that this thing existed. I was like, this is perfect. And I called Jason, he said, yeah, it's over. I was like, oh, okay. But he made it accessible to me so that I had access to the shell, so that I could look through some of the materials and start thinking about it. And some of the insights of UDL were things that I was already doing in my course design, but I didn't know that it was called something, right? So multiple modes of assessment, different formats, methods of conveying information. There are things that I did because I'm really committed to learner-centered teaching and finding the possibilities for social justice that exist in teaching, and finding out that it was a thing really opened up further possibilities for me and helped me to more clearly articulate what I was up to, and to be more conscious of how it was that I was building it, so knowing some of the theories that underlie it, that kind of thing. And as for why, it seemed like it's the right thing to do to provide learning opportunities that can include more people's different experiences and context, not just because it helps with individual outcomes, but because it helps to build a stronger learning community in the classroom. So does that answer it?
That's great.
So,
wonderful. So Kathryn, my next question's to you. So again, we spoke in the first session that UDL or thinking this way isn't just about students with disabilities, but that's where it started. It certainly started in the late 90s about how we can make these technologies or resources or learning spaces more accessible for students with disabilities, but didn't end there, and now we know that it's more about learner variability. So I'm just wondering, from a disability service provider, this idea that serving students with disabilities, I guess, but also without, that idea of a shared responsibility, and so how your philosophy or how your center kind of views that that shared piece, that shared responsibility.
I actually think the shift that Blundon is experiencing now is in tune with the shift that's happening across student life in terms of moving its work from transactional to transformative. Like, the timing couldn't have been better.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue, and being new to Memorial and having had the privilege of coming from provincial government who is working from a definition of disability under the social model, that Memorial has made public commitments to accessibility, diversity, and inclusion. So those concepts are very different than supporting a specific population of people who identify with specific disabilities. So we really are no longer in the business of building a specialized support system for a place where other people go to get access to their education that they can't get in their classroom. Those days really are over. We're talking about accessibility, we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about diversity because our student population is diverse. And we as an institution then must be inclusive. And in fact, if we weren't accessible, they wouldn't have come. So our shared responsibility is that Memorial can't be any of those things unless every one of us is working from a notion that who we are serving is the person who shows up. And the person who shows up, we don't actually know what they need yet, because we can't assume it because we're not living their lives. Ailsa had said earlier in the first session around working with students who are the experts in their lives, you cannot do work in accessibility without the people who need access to the service. And so that is the first thing we need to do from a shared responsibility, is talk to the end user, talk to the student, talk to whoever it is who's showing up at our door looking. So it has worked out really nicely that Blundon is taking a notion of transforming its work with students. We're talking about learning experiences and not what is your diagnosis, what is your disability, here's your accommodations. There are pieces of what might work for somebody when they describe their learning, and we might go that route, but we are talking about what it is you need as a learner in Memorial through student affairs. What can we help to provide that and to be that extension? We will see a change in roles, I think, when we invite the campus to look at being more accessible. Things like accommodations in a classroom, or accommodations that you need to access your information in the classroom, will start happening at the classroom level. So it doesn't mean that Blundon is getting out of the business of accommodations. What it means is Blundon is going to take its resources and its expertise and put it in the classroom with you and support you in teaching in a way that's going to meet a wide variety of learners. So we can't do this without a shared responsibility.
And it's amazing what you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit.
That's right.
Right?
Well, and I'd say Blundon hasn't gotten a whole lot of credit for a whole lot of time, so we're kind of used to that, I would say.
So I want to capitalize on the, you talked about the student voice. So Jen, you've done some work, been a part of a research project around Ailsa's course that was designed from the ground up, from the beginning, knowing that we don't know who these learners are going to be. We know they're going to be diverse. We don't know what challenges they're going to bring. So we want to design this from the beginning as accessibly as we can. So I'm just wondering what you heard in facilitating focus groups with students. You know, maybe some of the things that they were saying about being in a course that was designed that way. Did they know? Did they? So what were they saying?
Well, to start, we did the focus groups before the class had begun to be taught by Ailsa, just to get a feel for what students would be looking for in a course. And I was kind of the filter person so that Ailsa would be able to accumulate this information without knowing the students who have come forward to identify what they may need. As someone who has taken the class and someone who has also heard what the students had to say, primarily the people who identified with coming to this focus group were very interested in taking the class and came up with some core ideas and concepts that they knew that they want to cover in the class and have for the space in the class as well. So. Okay.
Yeah. And maybe I'm just wondering on top of that, as a student who's taken the course, when you were in that course, what were your initial reactions compared to maybe some of the other courses you had taken?
Sure. I think that the way the course is structured definitely helps with teaching yourself how you learn in university, because no one ever really taught you that. No one ever taught me that, especially. And with the way that the course is built and the like options and choices, you learn what works best for you based on trying out different options and based on what you know has worked possibly in other classes, especially if it's your first class even. You can like mix it up a little bit if you need to try a little bit of all the things to see what's going to work best for you based on your learning style and your execution style.
Thank you. Yeah. So before we go, I have some other questions for our panelists, but I'm just wondering, I think it'd be a good place to take some questions from anybody else. Anybody in the audience? We'll get you a microphone. Kyle, would you mind, or Ailsa? We'll take a couple of questions and then we'll get to the second round here.
Hi, I'm from the Faculty of Nursing, Center for Nursing Studies. Just Just a question on, so we have the academic component of in the classroom in a lab setting, but then we have to take it to the practical approach to the patient's bedside. How do you see that working on your universal design, and is it even possible when you're looking at patient safety and standards of practice and things like that? Because it's we're kind of catch there, so academically we can accommodate all we want, but when we actually go to the clinical setting, we're really tied, like, because we can't say, you can have extra time to run that code, because it's not going to work that way. You're dealing with someone's life and like that real practical issue. Anybody have any advice or?
Any of our panelists want to take that one?
It is the biggest question, is are we setting up our students for a false sense of reality? Because when you get into the workplace, these accommodations are not there. Well, first of all, they are there. They just look very differently, right? We have a duty to accommodate as a learner and a student, and we have a duty to accommodate our employees. So the duty to accommodate does not go away. The threshold for that undue hardship does not go away. So if our cohort here looks like they look, then that's the employee as well, right? So we've got to shift our thinking in terms of there's never going to be an accommodation at a workplace, when in fact there's going to be lots of accommodations. Someone asked earlier, or one of the ideas were that they're really expensive. And research will show that about $500 is the average cost, what it takes to satisfy an accommodation in a workplace. But what does it look like? And really, I see that now as Blundon's role when they engage with students to talk about how are we transferring this into the workplace for you. The extra time for on-demand assessment often is about knowing the safety net is there to actually do it. And in fact, if we looked at our students who are writing over in the center, seldom do they use the extra time. So we've got to be talking about what is this accommodation doing, and is it working for you and changing, and how are we going to adapt that. It does work in the workplace. I don't think we've thought about what it looks like because our generation didn't have these expectations or opportunities to have support in the workplace. It is our number one, we can give them this today, but it is never going to happen when they're in the field. But it is happening. Right. But is it because we haven't thought about what kinds of supports could we use? Like, of course, we're not going to set somebody up that they're not going to have a safe environment. So how does that accommodation look in the workplace? And have we given enough time and energy of supporting our students and our or future employees in figuring that out yet? I don't think we have. I think that the quick answer is it's not going to work. Ailsa wants to jump in.
Is that okay if I jump in? I think also you're talking about that you can do it academically, but then what happens when you move into the other context. But if you think about the connections between those two things, and if you think about if you're doing it academically, if one of the things you're doing, as Jen mentioned, is helping people figure out how they navigate things, then you're helping train people not only in like these are the practices, this is the information that you need, but this is how you can help your employer do what is their duty to do, right? So that if people can go in and have a better sense of what will work, right? So it's about the connection between that academic and that, so that what is being taught with the UDL in the classroom is also about becoming more aware of yourself as a learner and what it is, how it is that you work, so that you know how you can advocate for yourself, how you can make systems work in a way where you're part of the community and you're part of it, so that it's about the crossover between the two, and it's not necessarily the instructor's job to solve it, because part of it, I think, is that we may be teachers, but we've got to let go of the teacher hero thing, right? So like we open up doors for people, we create possibilities which they may or may not be able to take, and if we can help them figure out how to open doors, then that's wicked. But we can't. Wicked is the technical term. But we can't say like I'm going to solve all of it, right? So but one of the things it can do is it can help people have the tools to figure out how to solve it for themselves. Does that also help a bit?
Other questions from the audience? In the back?
Building on the thought of people having the tools to solve it for themselves. I'm not an academic. I'm not using UDL for academic purposes. But are there models of which the learners are actually integrated into the UDL and the solutions in which can be adopted, and how much that's encouraged? So yes, teaching a nursing student how to be accommodated, or accommodating that nursing, how much is that student accommodated, integrated into that solution, or coming up with that solution for that work, for that teaching environment, as well as for that workplace? Is that a common practice?
I can speak a little bit to that. In a previous talk, Ailsa spoke about when you're an instructor, you don't really know what you're going to teach until you know what your students are. And so I think the students play a strong role identifying their learning needs as well. So as a course instructor, I always ask questions of students. Like I teach courses on learning disabilities. So what's your prior knowledge and experience working with students with learning disabilities? What do you want to get from this course? How best would you be able to demonstrate your knowledge? And so I think that we need, as instructors, to give students an active role in thinking about how they learn best, how they want to break down their work into manageable chunks and demonstrate what they know. So I think that's, I don't know if I'm answering your question appropriately, but I think that's one way we involve students. I think they can have a choice in choosing a type of assessment. So if we want to focus on, do a compare-contrast kind of essay without those written argumentative skills, maybe they can choose the topic on which they're reporting on, right? So there's ways that we can embed choice or flexibility with deadlines to give students opportunities to demonstrate what they know in their preferred modality. Some people are tech savvy, some people aren't. Some people feel comfortable, I might feel comfortable speaking with a microphone and winging it, but other students may feel more comfortable preparing a podcast beforehand where they can edit their work and share the finished product, right? So I think research shows that when students are given choice in regards to how they want to demonstrate what they know, they often choose a preferred learning style which represents what's appropriate for them, and they don't undercut themselves. They don't choose the easy way out. Most students choose a way to demonstrate them and choose a topic relevant to different children. You still learning?
Joel?
Thank you. Joel Deshay from the Department of English. I love a lot of these ideas. Many of the things you've mentioned I'm already doing in my classroom. But one of the concerns I have is a kind of barrier for me, which is the time that is needed sometimes to adapt to a new diversity of students with every iteration of a course. And I love the idea of asking students at the beginning of a course, what do you want to learn? What do you need? I really do. But I just finished marking a bunch of final exams in one of my courses, and one of the questions is, it's an optional question. They don't have to answer it, but a lot of students do. It's a question that just says, if you had one revelation about this subject matter throughout the term, what was it? And they always, like 90% of them say, I didn't expect to learn this, but I loved this, and whatever it is. So they don't know what they want when they start the course. And in some ways, it's my job to anticipate that, and the design is to anticipate, right, as much as I can. So given that, if that's true, then I want to ask, from a student perspective, I wanted to know how much time would you tolerate, you think, at the beginning of a course, having a discussion that helps to design the course? Is it going to be 2 weeks, a week? Would you take a month out of a course, like 1/3 of the term? How much of the time would most students, do you think, be willing to spend in that? And I know I'm using the language of most students, and I'm asking you to generalize, and that might not be fair, but I am really curious. What could I do?
I think with the class with Ailsa, we had about 2 weeks at the beginning to make our choices about what options we had for the course. Was it?
Yeah,
if I'm remembering properly?
Yeah, the choices were just about the forms of assessment.
Yeah.
The material was already set. So what the syllabus was already set. The consultations that Jen was talking about happened during course design, because I was designing the course using CPAR stuff. so that was it. It was 2 weeks that people had to consider it. In the meantime, we were going over central concepts and doing group work and doing a bunch of other things so that people could get a sense of what those different forms of assessment would look like when there was no assessment happening. So we did some group work, some written work, and does that sound right to your memory?
And then we also we had the consultations, which the students who were prospecting to be into the course offered up ideas of what they would like to see in the course. So some of the things that they recommended be in the course were then put in the syllabus before the course started.
And it may or may not be content, right? Like the content might be set. This is the content, and my colleagues and I often joke about Henry Ford's quote, it's been attributed to him, that if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. They didn't know what was possible. And so I think there's a little bit of that we have responsibility for too. That, and Joel, I think this speaks to the comments that you saw in your exam, that I didn't know it was going to go here, but wow, this was great. And they couldn't have even imagined that they were going to go there. So there is some of that we have to kind of own and say, we're the content experts. But I think around, certainly around assessment, or the multiple ways that we represent that. So is there a nice video that's captioned that we can kind of show and throw in the Brightspace shell that supports some of that harder, kind of drier material that makes it a little more accessible, again, small a or capital A, in addition to what you've used, right? So sometimes it's not necessarily choosing the content might be set, but how do we choose how to supplement that or assess for that? And sometimes students really struggle with when you give them, for example, 5 different ways that are going to be assessed and have them choose what percentage is that going to be worth. So they can choose it's going to be either 5% or 15%. And if I'm really strong on papers, I'm going to choose 15%. If I'm not really strong on the group piece, that might be less. But I think that speaks to, as well, one of the notions that UDL really highlights is that it really helps to create expert learners. So it's not just the content. We're not just teaching the content. We're teaching these students how to learn. And there's a lot of self-regulation and self-reflection that goes with this framework that allows students to do that. And they take that to the next course. When they forgot all the content from your course, they can still apply all these principles to the next course. Right? So that's the nice thing about UDL. And that's captured, I think, very well in the new guidelines that Gabrielle talked about earlier. They actually built it in and said, this is how this particular piece builds expert learners. And it moves them through those guidelines. Were there other questions? Yes?
My wife's a nurse, so I want to kind of build on what the nurses have said here. But I see, like, a lot of cognitive connections here, right? But I'm just wondering, I think what you're getting at is more like sensory, psychomotor. Because I'm a science teacher. I have skills I need to see good, right? And it's kind of, it's troubling for me to try to figure that out in terms of, because and we do have to evaluate those things, right? It's tangly. Right? It's cognitively, I can get it. I guess how can you take like a skill like trait to somebody and saying can you write a short answer for that for me? It's one of those things you just have to perform, right? And if somebody doesn't have the psychomotor ability to perform that task, where does that leave them? And it does am I missing the boat here? Does it not encompass that, or is that something that have to be tackled? So.
Anyone? So we've kind of bridged. Again, I think some of this is accommodations, like accommodation speak, and some of it is UDL or kind of upfront design. And I think Kathryn spoke to the fact that if we all in this room, or let's say the entire university, they mandated UDL, or in the U.S., UDL's in their higher education legislation. So if you're a faculty of education in the U.S., you have to teach to this. So if all of a sudden everyone at Memorial, all the educators here, embraced UDL and said, I'm doing this tomorrow, starting tomorrow, accommodations aren't going anywhere. And so it sounds like we're walking that between accommodation and that upfront kind of design from a universal perspective.
Yeah, am I at what, where, or why? I mean, is it how, what, or why? Is it?
From my perspective, it's about not everyone can do everything, right? When you talk about employment for people with disabilities in a large group of people and you're open up the floor for dialogue, the very first comment usually is, well, if they're blind, they can't be a pilot. But can we talk about how to increase employment for people with disabilities? Like, we always go to the nth degree about what we can't do. So when we design in a way that is capturing the most people with the least amount of effort, we're going to be grabbing the majority of people in any kind of a gathering. If people need certain things to support them in the way they learn, they will adapt to using that in a way that meets their needs and whatever the environment that they're in. Will, at the end of the day, you be able to do something without adaptation in a way that is up to standard? Maybe not. But I don't know, we have spent enough time figuring out what would putting in a trach look like if you didn't do it by yourself. Have we had that conversation to the nth degree about what it would look like? And if we did, at the end of the day, then person X, who needs that adaptation, can't do a trach. But I think we go there really quickly and say, it can't be done because we've never done it, and it doesn't make sense, and it's not how the nursings are doing it now, and those kinds of things. And that's not meant to be, I'm not singling out anybody's thinking, that's all of our thinking. It's our biases and our prejudices about not being able to see what it could possibly look like if it looked different than what we know, right? That's sort of where I would go with those kinds of ideas. And so accommodations will never go away. It's just, if you want people to learn, we know that the research says you need to be connected, engaged, and feel a sense of belonging. I know that if you have to learn and you have to go over to the Blundon Center to do it, and everybody else stays in your classroom, your sense of a connection and belonging is very different than your peers. And that's what UDL will do in terms of that sort of small piece of your experience. And I get sort of riled up when I talk about stuff like this. Comes across sometimes as anger, but it's not. It's enthusiasm, isn't it? Yes.
Nice reframe.
I'll speak to that just really shortly. I think universal design for learning asks us to think about our essential understandings and how we can assess those. And so if you're looking at history for this area, perhaps the essential understanding is that you want students to be able to describe something in a linear format. So that can be done orally in written format, they can draw a graphic, use a text to give a voiceover, right? So maybe the essential understanding is how to trace someone, how do you, maybe that can't be replicated. Maybe the doing piece, the understanding piece can be demonstrated maybe in multiple ways. Maybe the doing piece can't be changed per se, but I really think that when you think about how we give students choice in demonstrating what they know, when I teach courses I may have 80% of required course material, but students can have a choice in regards to how they teach certain parts of that material back to their peers. They can choose what they want to focus on for their final case study depending on the students that they teach. And so as I support graduate students, I have to think about the accessibility piece as well. And I had a friend who did a doctoral dissertation in YouTube video format. And so it wasn't very easy to think about how you can synthesize a 200-page document into 4 or 5 videos. But when she had to think about what were the main ideas, and she did have to create a blog to engage the research literature, but that was not an easy task for her. And we think about authorship and we review that and the impact of that research. And she's now working in industries at a very, very, very strong business. So sometimes students give them choice in regards to what they need to help their life goals. And sometimes they don't make the piece available and really surprises them to do that. What she said.
Yeah, to build upon what you had said, Kathryn, about like not having leaving the classroom. For about, I'm going to say 2 years now, I've identified what I need to work with my professors very closely, and I haven't needed to leave the classroom to go to the Blundon Center in probably 2.5 years. So that like I feel more connected to my professors and my class, knowing that I have the tools that I need with me, and that if there is anything additional that I need on top of that, I can just approach the professor and just simply ask, and what they can do for me in any way is definitely fair game, if it's within reason. Like, I'm not asking for anything really outside the box.
Thank you. Question back here, yeah.
Ailsa, you're doing a fantastic job.
Thank you very much. My name is Ken Snellgram. I'm from engineering, civil engineering, and I was just wondering. You know, we went to the session this morning where there was a panel discussion, and we talked about transformational learning and taking students outside of their comfort zones, and respectively challenging students. And there seems to be, you know, maybe a blurry line between respectively challenging and accommodating. And you know, I don't understand myself, I guess, where those lines are. Are there hard and fast lines between respectively challenging students to rise to a new task or a new? Because it's not all about the content. Sometimes it's about the process. And I pose this to the panel, I guess, that how can we differentiate between respectively challenging and not just, but deferring to accommodation?
Yeah, so specifically for accommodations, I guess, but there's also, this is consistent with some of the criticisms of UDL that go along with rigor, and, you know, and academic integrity. Lowering the bar, I know, is something that oftentimes folks feel that if we're making these accommodations, or if we design these courses, or can we actually design these courses with rigor and still make them accessible and still provide accommodations for students? So. Anybody want to take that? Anybody, or Kathryn?
Question
Gabe?
long escaped me. When I think about supporting and accommodating students, there's a variety of ways to do that. And
in regards to supporting graduate students and my strong students have very severe learning difficulties. And so the work they have produced has been phenomenal, but it requires a lot of support in regards to allowing them to think about the process, about some of my cognitive skills, supporting them in breaking down the work into manageable chunks. And so in regards to how I've supported and accommodated those students, I don't think it's any more work to accommodate in regards to how I support those students versus accommodating students that aren't coming to meetings without having a lot of support, right? So I think there's ways we can support students that need to think about their thinking. And when I think about accommodating students, when I teach face-to-face, oftentimes I try to have a 5-minute interview with the student in the first 1/3 of the semester, and I ask them, what do I do for you in a successful in this course? And some of the things they ask for are things that we do for all students. And so I've had students with high anxiety that need to turn their math in the exam, and you know, students that get so anxious at physical active writing, type handwriting for it, they're anxious about their spelling, how they organize themselves. And so oftentimes I might put an exam towards the end of a period, or I'll, we won't know the questions before they come to the exam room, but I will walk them down the exam room. They can all write on the computers if they want to do so. They can all take time and a half. They all have to email me the response before they leave that day. But there's ways that you can support students with intersectionality, support students that may have high anxiety, or with a little family support given whatever's going on in their lives. And sometimes it's not a lot more work, and it doesn't hurt some students that are very much sometimes provide that support. I think just being creative and providing that support.
Go ahead. I think what I heard in your question is that you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the idea that we're supposed to respectfully challenge students paired, like butting up it against.
Not really butting, just blurring of the line.
Blurring,
you know,
yeah.
Is there a blurred line? And I don't know, it's not my area, so.
Yeah.
You know, I heard something from one session, and now we're
I think it
talking about
actually
other-
makes sense
other
to ask that, and it has to do with when we're talking about UDL and when we're talking about accommodations and how there's sometimes a blurry line there as well.
Okay.
But when we talk about how UDL can be about creating expert learners, that is a challenging conversation. That is respectfully challenging people. Like that's so. Jen, how do people respond in the class? I said, okay, you're going to decide this. Like terror. This was it wasn't an easy thing, and walking people through what are the different things that you might want to think about, right? This has to do with the ways that you feel like you want to do it. It might have to do with your workload. It might have to do with the fact that you always ask for extensions on final papers, and that you're really tired of being that guy, right? So you're going to do an exam because you'll have it done when it's over, and you can't ask for an extension even though you know you'd do better on the paper, right? Like, but then I'll let you answer that. Right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's kind of surprising when you first get to have the choice because you have never really been given a choice in how, like, I guess there was probably like 5 or 6 choices within additional choices. Like you can be so flexible. Like, for example, I know from learning how I learned that I work really well with visuals. So I only submitted papers and work that was strictly visual work. My final project was done on transparency slides and demonstrated how my own personal brain worked to Ailsa, and that was my project. But it followed all the guidelines of the project. And like, I know there was a couple people that were sitting behind me that kept on just like debating, like, oh, should I do this? Should I do that? But ultimately, when there's a cutoff date of when you get to choose, you have to make your choice, and you just do it. Like, you just know what you want, and even though you're not used to the choice, you just get it. You get to have one. Pretty sweet, actually.
Would you recommend starting that off in like the first year course so they kind of progress through it? So when you get to 4th year, or as a graduate student, all of a sudden you're like, fuck, choice, choice. So, you know, you're first right out of high school, who's just kind of come to Monterey University and totally frightened to death. They've never been, I don't know, responsible for their own learning is really accurate to say. But like, would you allow them to have that choice?
Yes. But there's also different ways to do it. So and at the lower level, it's less about choice and more about having a variety of things that are all there so they get a sense of all of it. So
This isn't about choosing to take the exam or not, although it may be, right?
I've never taught a course where one thing can sink you, right? And
I don't mean to defend anybody in the math department, but you write a 60% math final.
yeah.
You're screwed. Some people in the math department are right there with you.
But
No math.
there are also maybe not in math, but there are also students with specific learning disorders that would say, I would rather have 100% final, because at the speed at which I learn, I'm going to need the entire semester to learn it. I'll rock that 100% final. And so there is that argument as well, although we can't do that because we have to give them 20% of their grade back. But what does that look like? So, okay, I can't give 100% final, but what does it look like? And it may be that you don't have an exam, or you do have an exam, or it's a low-stakes exam, or there's a variety. And often, this isn't removing entirely some of those barriers. It's maybe removing some of the weight so that it's not as anxiety-producing, right? We're out of time, so I acknowledge that.
How did that happen?
I know. It's not my fault. I just...
You said it.
So I know you have other places to be that are equally or more important than here. So I wanted to take this time to, I think we touched on everything. So thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you for the questions. And we're going to stay here for a little bit. If you do have time, we will stick around. And this isn't the end of UDL. This is the end of it for this particular conference. But there's a lot of momentum building here at Memorial around universal design for learning and just accessibility in general in learning spaces. So, so keep an eye out for that. And thanks again for being here.
Plug Blundon's.